Good morning, everybody, and thank you. The time is short, so I'll try to stay on time. These are my disclosures. As you all know, there's tremendous controversy over the incidence, severity, and consequences of mesh sling complications. There's a paucity of quality studies concerning serious complications for these procedures. And unfortunately, in our review, we're unable to find any high-level scientific methodology. And what I'm going to show you is not high-level methodology, but we're doing the best that we can to make these comparisons, which is the aim of this study. This was a systemic literature review using the search terms pubovaginal sling, fascial sling, autologous slings, and complications of. For the synthetic sling comparisons, we referenced a literature review that we did using the same methodology that we're going to be describing. Complications were those that we consider to be serious. You may disagree. For the data analysis, and this is the unique part, doing the best we can, we took the total number of patients with each complication cited in each study as the numerator, and for the denominator, we used the total number of patients in all studies in the literature that we thought, by reviewing the papers, reported those complications. So we analyzed 71 papers after the exclusion criteria listed here. There was no exclusion criteria for follow-up for complications, so all complications we recorded in the numerators. So here are here's the results. The total size of the cohorts were much greater, as you can see, for the synthetic slings. Death was comparable in both series, very, very uncommon. Bladder perforation bladder perforation was much more common in synthetic slings, and wound complications and urethral obstruction were more common in autologous slings. Oops, sorry. Erosions, vaginal and bladder erosions, much more common in synthetic slings. Dyspareunia and refractory pain, much more common in synthetic slings. So in conclusion, we didn't give the data on this, but efficacy, everybody agrees, is comparable between the two procedures. There's no simple way of comparing autologous to synthetic slings because of the asynchronous time periods they were performed in. There are no standardized operative techniques for autologous slings, and there's scant follow-up methodology and data about serious complications for either autologous slings or synthetic slings. De novo, according to our evaluation, de novo overactive bladder urethral erosions are comparable between the two procedures. Urethral obstruction and wound complications are more common after autologous slings. Bladder perforations are more common after synthetic slings, but vaginal and bladder erosions are more common after synthetic slings. The elephant in the room to me is that refractory pelvic pain and dyspareunia is much more common after synthetic slings, and for many of these patients it becomes, I think, a permanent problem. The literature, in our judgment, is simply devoid of studies about the long-term consequences of these serious complications, and we simply need to do better to keep track of these complications so we can come to better scientific conclusions about how we're doing with these procedures or how the patients are doing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jerry, for presenting this paper. I think it's very important. My comment actually is in the literature review, you may find most of the cases reviewed for the pubovaginal sling are done for complicated cases, radiation, fixed urethra, and so on. So really there is a paucity of literature and knowledge about doing it in primary cases. So we can have a fair comparison between the synthetic slings and fascial slings.
I totally agree.
Jerry, First of all, I would like to make a congratulations for sorry, for your study, and I agree completely with your last sentence, and we need to do better. And there is a concern in Europe. I work in Europe, and the majority of European countries, they do synthetic sling, midurethral sling. They are very afraid about the pubovaginal sling for the problem of post-voiding reflection and for the problem of wound infection postoperatively. So I know that here in the States is probably the opposite. You are very concerned about synthetic sling. According to your great experience, which is you think will be the future for the treatment of stress incontinence, synthetic or we go back to the pubovaginal?
I'd rather answer what I think should be the future. I think the future has to be better than the synthetic slings with respect to complications. I accept the success rate. I think they're both very good. I think a properly done autologous sling by a knowledgeable person doesn't have any of these complications. I didn't want to be self-serving, but it comes out self-serving about what I'm about to say. Our original study in, I think it was 2000 or 1998, of about 250 patients, where we used back then a diary, a pad test, and a questionnaire, all validated instruments, had none of these complications. I've personally never had a person, never, not once, had a person that we did an autologous sling that required us to take it down afterwards until 9 or 10 years later. The problem with the autologous slings is for everybody my age and a couple of generations below that learned to do them were taught by Shlomo Raz that you had to put the bladder neck in what he called a high retropubic position. So everybody was making them too tight for decades later. Okay, I didn't. Okay, and I think if you follow the surgical technique that we use, making the sling so loose that we can put 3 fingers between the fascia and the knot when you tie it over the fascia, the incidence of permanent retention is simply 0, unless there are some people that have like a pipe stem urethra. You can't. There's some people you cannot do that. But for the average, for the so-called index patient, it just shouldn't happen. I mean, that's my opinion. So I think the future should be either an autologous sling or a sling that doesn't have these other complications. God bless if someone figures out how to not get the complications. I'm not so concerned about obstruction because you can just about always unobstruct a person, whether it's an autologous sling or fascial sling. But chronic pain, dyspareunia, I mean, there's too many patients that have that problem, and refractory overactive bladder.
Thank you.